Charles Spencer entered a room full of royals, dressed in a Savile Row tuxedo and holding a folded piece of blue paper, the contents of which nobody had approved. In about 15 minutes, the carefully crafted narrative around Queen Camilla crumbled on live television. The palace, confidently handing him the podium, had actually invited him to speak. They wrote a speech for him, loaded it into the teleprompters, and expected him to adhere to the usual aristocratic script, polite remarks about legacy and unity before heading home. However, Charles Spencer isn't just any aristocrat. He's the brother who delivered that unforgettable eulogy at Westminster Abbey, refusing to let the palace dictate how Diana's sons mourned their mother. He even spent 6 months collaborating with lawyers to establish a tightly sealed legal framework that even the king couldn't bypass. When he stood at the podium at the Victoria and Albert Museum, he wasn't going there to give up anything. He was ready to make a statement. Before diving into the specifics of how everything unfolded, it's worth noting how the contradictions began stacking up even before he entered the gala. Earlier that day, the palace press office had leaked a briefing to the Times, claiming that the Spencer family would be turning over Diana's final artifacts to the Crown Trust. They framed it as an act of healing and unity, fully aware that if the public anticipated a surrender, Charles would appear to be the one being aggressive if he refused. This was a classic palace public relations tactic. Create an expectation, apply pressure through public perception, and paint anyone who resists as petty. They assumed that Charles would cave in, but they were mistaken. What they didn't know, and what only 2 people in that entire room were aware of, was that Charles and Prince William had been working on an entirely different plan. This timeline is crucial because it highlights that this was no spontaneous, emotional outburst. It stemmed from 6 months of careful legal preparation. And shock faded, and then they would attempt to reshape her legacy. So, when Charles Spencer spoke up at the Royal Gala, he was doing more than making a statement. He was responding to that long-ago conversation, armed with the knowledge of that obscure clause from Diana's divorce settlement. For 6 months, everything had been kept under wraps, not a word to anyone, not even to his staff or close friends, all to keep it away from the palace's influence. He had a lead barrister working diligently on establishing a legal construct known as a sovereign trust, which could operate outside the Crown's authority. While the British monarch holds considerable power, this sovereign immunity doesn't extend to private trusts when set up correctly. Back in 1996, when Diana was finalizing her divorce, she had her team sneak in a clever clause. It stated that her personal writings and intellectual property, such as her diaries and letters, would never be considered royal property, remaining forever with her as a private citizen. The palace, fixated on stripping her of her royal title, missed this critical detail and failed to recognize how much it would matter in the years to come. Diana's legal team had outmaneuvered the palace's seasoned lawyers, who were busy debating titles and legal precedents while ignoring the importance of this seemingly minor detail hidden deep in paragraph 17. Subsection 4 of the financial settlement. It didn't involve cash or traditional assets, but was about the kinds of things that don't appear on financial reports. The palace lawyers barely acknowledged it, focusing instead on the divorce payout. Little did they suspect that, almost 3 decades later, this overlooked clause would form the backbone of Charles Spencer's efforts to challenge their narrative control. He was aware of this clever legal move because Diana had confided in him, recounting their summer afternoon conversation at Althorpe, where she revealed her worries about the future rewriting of her story. Grand presentation, but Charles had different plans. Before he arrived, the atmosphere felt almost like a celebration. The palace had meticulously organized every detail, from the warm lighting to the vintage Krug champagne. They even arranged the seating to showcase Camilla at the center, surrounded by loyal supporters and carefully chosen aristocrats who would cheer at just the right moments. Cameras were set to capture her in the best light, and the teleprompters were fully prepped. It was all part of a well-crafted production meant to send out the message that the past was behind them, the crown was successful, and they were now a united family. Meanwhile, Camilla sat at the head table adorned with the Greville emeralds, a real statement piece with serious history having belonged to Queen Mary and later to the Queen Mother. She was playing the part of the matriarch, the woman who weathered the storms of scandal and finally found her place on the throne. Her PR team had worked for years to reshape her image as the quiet, misunderstood partner of the king, and this gala was meant to be the pinnacle of that effort, a step toward assimilating Diana's legacy into the palace's tight narrative. The white lilies, Diana's favorite flowers, were everywhere, almost too perfect as decorations for an event designed to contain her memory. As she engaged in light conversation about healing and unity with the French ambassador, she brushed aside her equerry's worries about Charles's arrival, thinking his tension was just nerves, maybe related to the public humiliation of surrendering. Little did she know that Charles Spencer had prepared his own script, one crafted over 6 months through secretive meetings and encrypted communications, far from royal scrutiny. He was a man of his word, and had promised never to let anyone take everything away, including a legacy that was intimately tied to his family. The scene is nothing short of pandemonium. While all this was happening, Prince William remained composed at his table, just 2 away from the action, wearing his evening dress as if nothing was amiss. Yet, beneath that calm exterior was razor-sharp focus, not stoicism, and a hidden black encrypted phone in his pocket. This was a bold move, considering the massive security risks associated with using unauthorized devices at a royal event. But being the Prince of Wales, he had access to emergency override codes that allowed him to tap into the Royal Broadcasting Network, a fail-safe meant for national crises, and nobody was about to challenge his authority. What he did with that authority was nothing short of audacious. Instead of merely scrambling a teleprompter, William took control of the entire broadcast feed. While Charles Spencer approached the podium with a speech approved by the palace, the first line projected on the screens read, "I am profoundly honored to permanently transfer the Spencer Historical Trust to the Crown." Those words were mere moments from being delivered when William swiftly tapped his phone twice, causing the screens to go dark. This sent the control room into total chaos. Technicians were inundated with error codes and attempts to cut the live feed to the 3 million viewers at home, but they found themselves powerless. William had activated a code Alpha Override meant for emergencies, making it impossible to halt the broadcast without physically disconnecting the power cables from the museum. That was out of the question, especially during a live royal event. Inside the control room, the atmosphere was electric. Technicians were shouting over one another, desperately typing commands that yielded no results, pulling up diagnostic screens only to find that the entire system was locked down. Meanwhile, the director was frantically screaming into the headset, demanding someone kill the master power switch, unaware that it was locked away in a secure room 2 floors down, with access codes rendered useless by the override protocol. The broadcast engineers, who had meticulously prepared for this gala through endless rehearsals and checks, suddenly found themselves completely shut out from their own equipment. The panic was palpable, as one technician later described the utter confusion that engulfed the room. It was like watching a ghost take charge of a ship while chaos swirled around. As everyone else panicked, Charles Spencer calmly unfolded his blue paper, ready to speak. Meanwhile, The 3 million viewers at home had no clue that they were witnessing a technological shift unfold in real time. They just saw a man approach the podium, armed with nothing but a single folded document and no teleprompter, sensing something unexpected was about to occur, something the palace hadn't arranged. So here was Charles, standing before 500 aristocrats and dignitaries without an approved speech. He didn't show any signs of panic or hesitation. Instead, he reached into his tuxedo jacket and revealed that pale blue paper which bore the seal of the High Court of Chancery. It's important to note what that seal signifies. This court deals with trusts, estates, and equitable claims, not criminal matters. When you see that seal, it means something has been established legally at the highest level. When Camilla spotted that seal, her expression changed dramatically, turning pale even before Charles began to speak. She understood that what was on that paper had already been approved by the courts. It was a done deal. As he started to talk, his tone wasn't just angry. It carried a calmness laced with melancholy, almost a sense of nostalgia. He addressed how history is shaped by those who live to tell it, how grief is softened and tidied with time, and how Diana never lived a neat life, not wanting her truth to be sanitized by an institution that sought to silence her. He portrayed his sister not simply as a princess or a public figure, but as a real woman who expressed her feelings in her private journals late at night, documenting her struggles and triumphs in her own handwriting. Diana deserved her voice to be preserved exactly as she left it. Charles also spoke of the promises he made to her, commitments that had weighed heavily on him for almost 30 years, promises he was now finally able to fulfill. Then he read the declaration. All of Diana's personal archives, her handwritten diaries, and her private letters were being moved into a new trust, not the Crown Trust, nor the Royal Historical Trust, but a completely separate entity altogether. The executors of the 1,997 Heritage Trust were not palace courtiers, but Diana's own sons, William and Harry. They had just authorized the immediate global publication of her final journals without any redactions, and that news shattered the room. Camilla physically recoiled in shock, knocking over her water goblet, sending ice water cascading across the pristine white damask tablecloth, leaving a noticeable stain. No one moved to assist her. No equerry rushed forward with a napkin. The aristocratic crowd, individuals groomed from birth to adhere to strict etiquette, completely abandoned decorum. Dukes sprang from their chairs, duchesses gasped aloud, and the press surged past their barricades, cameras flashing and reporters clamoring with questions. Amidst all the chaos, William remained perfectly still for a moment, then slowly pushed back his chair and began walking toward Camilla's table. His protection officers were shouting for him to stop, and Arthur, the equerry, attempted to intercept him. But William simply said, "Stand down, Arthur," and kept moving. The equerry froze, recognizing the authority of the future king, not the current one or the queen consort, but the heir who will one day assume the throne. Tension hung in the air as Arthur's training prevailed over his panic, and he stepped aside. William reached the head table, leaned down, and placed both hands flat on the wet tablecloth. He brought his face close to Camilla's, and she whispered his name, her voice stripped of all royal composure. She asked what he had done, and he replied that he had simply done what the palace instructed. He secured the history of their family. Then he picked up the black encrypted phone, tapped the screen, and showed her what appeared on it, a delivery confirmation from the BBC, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. The entire Spencer archives had been decrypted and were set for publication. The global embargo was about to lift in just 60 seconds. Now, Regarding what was actually written in those diaries, the shocked reactions from the journalists present revealed everything. A veteran royal correspondent, a seasoned journalist who had covered palace scandals for 30 years, opened the file on her tablet and immediately dropped it to the marble floor. She sank to her knees, sobbing, a reaction that was truly out of character for someone so hardened by the intensity of palace drama. What she encountered on that first page was a diary entry from August 1997. Just weeks before Diana passed away, she wrote about the palace courtiers, those men in gray suits, finalizing a plan against her. Diana mentioned they might not be able to erase her while she was alive, but they would sanitize her memory after her death. She foresaw a grand public unification of her charities and a scenario where her family would be compelled to hand over her history to the royal trust. Camilla, in her emeralds, would smile for the cameras, using Diana's legacy to cleanse her own image. This was all written by Diana in 1997, predicting exactly what was unfolding in that very room. As a journalist read Diana's words aloud to an audience of 500 people and 3 million viewers, Camilla sat there in the emeralds, and the carefully crafted illusion of her as the quiet, devoted consort vanished. Diana had called this decades in advance, and now the entire world was listening. But it got even worse for the palace when the secure emergency line at the head table began to ring. This was the red phone, meant for direct communication with the sovereign, and King Charles III was watching the broadcast from Buckingham Palace, calling into the room. Arthur, the equerry, reached for the phone, his hands shaking, but William was quicker. He snatched the receiver, walked back to the podium, and pressed the earpiece to the live microphone, letting everyone hear his father's urgent words. The king spoke with a rawness, devoid of his usual measured tone, sounding panicked as he ordered William to cut the feed immediately before everything fell apart. This moment marked the outpouring of 30 years of suppressed grief and anger. William stood at that podium, the same one where his uncle had just caused a stir, and spoke directly to his father on live television. He reminded Charles of that cold morning in 1997 at Balmoral, when a 15-year-old boy had to button up his dark suit, hold back his tears, and walk behind his mother's coffin. For the good of the crown, he spoke about 3 decades spent quietly supporting the woman who had broken his mother's heart. He reflected on his role as the dutiful shield, the obedient heir, protecting an institution that had asked so much of him while giving nothing back. As a teenager at Eton, he remembered the sleepless nights in his dormitory, listening to other boys whisper about his mother's death, the endless conspiracy theories and sensational tabloid stories. Each morning, he had to rise and act as if none of it affected him, because that's just what princes did. They endured, remained silent, and prioritized the crown above all else. Then, he delivered the words that changed everything, stating, "The crown does not own her soul, and you will not own her history. The embargo is lifted. The world will read her words unedited and unchained." Pressing the red button, he disconnected the call with the King of England. While 3 million people tuned in, the silence that followed was brief, lasting maybe just 1 second before the room erupted not in panic, but in applause. A roaring ovation that shattered centuries of royal protocol. Dukes, ambassadors, charity workers, and journalists, all expected to maintain their composure, stood up to cheer. In the midst of it all, Queen Camilla appeared defeated, tears streaming down her face, the Greville emeralds weighing heavily around her neck, overshadowed by a legacy she could never overcome. When you compare the palace's narrative to the actual events, it falls apart completely. That morning they had told the Times that the Spencers were giving up the archives. However, Charles Spencer rose and read a legal declaration proving that the archives were already stored in a sovereign trust, well out of the Crown's reach. They claim this gala was meant for unity and healing, but Diana's diary from 1997 had already detailed a scenario that served as a blueprint for erasing her memory. They presented Camilla as the dignified queen consort who had rightfully earned her position, but as she sat there with a knocked-over water goblet and a pale face, her stepson was openly challenging her husband's authority on live television. That narrative is simply beyond repair, and a crisis like this can't be solved with a carefully crafted message. The palace is out of options. The world now has Diana's words because the documents have been published and the embargo has been lifted. This means that the trust is legally sovereign, so no one can seal those archives or limit access. Not the king, not the palace lawyers, and not the government. In a single night, Charles Spencer and Prince William didn't just win a public relations battle, they permanently altered the legal landscape. For 3 decades, the palace attempted to manage Diana's legacy, but during their gala, with cameras capturing everything, they lost that control for good. The ghost they aimed to contain and conceal just made a spectacular exit, burning down the archive in the process.